and welcome to the Road to Genome podcast. This episode is being brought to you from Genomics England's headquarters in central London. I'm your host, Helen Bethel, Genetic Counsellor and Workforce Development and Education Lead for the North Eastern Yorkshire Genomic Medicine Service. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Helen Thomas, Chief Medical Officer for Genomics England. So, hi, Ellen. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Helen.
No problem. So, can we start by asking what your current job titles are?
Yes, so I am the Chief Medical Officer at Genomics England. We are a government-owned organisation. We were set up in 2013 to originally to deliver the 100,000 Genomes project, and we now occupy a space in the UK genomics ecosystem where we're between healthcare and research and the life sciences sector, and we deliver programmes and we also offer services to the NHS, and I look after the NHS-facing side of our operations. And I do also have an honorary consultant role in the NHS. I'm an honorary consultant in clinical genetics at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. And I spend some time there working with the South East Genomics Laboratory Hub and working with the clinical scientists providing clinical input in the lab.
Great. That sounds like such a big role. That sounds fantastic. So when you were a child, was that the job that you aspired to do?
No, it wasn't. I wanted to be an English teacher.
Oh, really? Quite the opposite then.
But by the time I chose my A-levels, I was really enjoying science and maths. And that was really what then led me into medicine. And then working in genetics actually happened purely by chance. I think many of the best career moves happen by chance.
Yeah.
And I was wanting to choose a subject to specialise in my third year at medical school to do a more scientific year. And I didn't do very well in my second year exams. And all of the courses that I'd chosen were fully booked, and I was told I could either study plant sciences or genetics. Those were the courses with spaces left. So I said, yes, please, I'll have genetics. And so I absolutely loved it, and then discovered later on in my medical training that genetics was a subject that you could do as a clinical specialty in clinical genetics. And really at that point was clear that that was the right route for me.
So did you specialise in any area of medicine before you came to genomics? So often kind of clinical geneticists have done particular specialties before they come into clinical genetics. Was that the case for you? Or?
Yes. So I studied genetics as my scientific degree during my undergraduate training. I was also very lucky to spend some time with clinical geneticists at Great Ormond Street and in Oxford, and also as part of my elective at the Hôpital Necker, which is the Paris equivalent of Great Ormond Street, during my training. So I actually spent quite a lot of my undergraduate time in clinical genetics, which was a great privilege. I then, after I'd qualified, spent the usual 3 years doing jobs in medicine, surgery, paediatrics, before I started my genetics training.
So within your clinical genetics work, do you still tend to focus more on rare disease rather than cancer with having a paediatric background?
Yes. So I've worked in both adult and paediatric genetics. So we all train in both in the UK system. And I developed a specialist interest on the way through in conditions which affect adults with genetic conditions. So I've worked a bit in cardiac conditions and in renal conditions. But my work now is very much more based around the laboratory and around implementation science rather than being specifically patient-facing these days.
And is that the case even for your clinical role with St Guy's? Are you patient-facing in that role?
No, I'm not patient-facing anymore. The role at Genomics England really takes up the majority of my time, and my background, the PhD that I did, which was very much looking at new genomic technologies, or they were new at the time, with next-generation sequencing, and understanding how to use those technologies in healthcare, meant that after I got back to clinical care after my PhD, it made sense to spend some of my time working with the laboratory and thinking about the clinical implications of how we deliver new technologies and innovations into diagnostic testing in genomics. And so that's really where I've spent most of my time focusing since then.
Yeah, and I think I hear echoes of our interview with Amanda Pecchini, who, described her career as involving time as a genetic counsellor in the lab, and kind of that crossover and what those cross roles can bring. And it almost kind of echoes your role rather than going back to that clinical facing, but actually, sit in your work within the lab?
Yes, and I think that's one of the wonderful things about working in and around the NHS is that there is a role for everybody, whatever your interests, whether they're more scientific, whether they're more technological, whether they're more sort of process and implementation, or whether they are more patient-facing. And we need people with all of those interests coming together to really deliver the kinds of services that we want to deliver.
Yeah. So thinking back to your clinical work, is there a particular case that you carry with you or that sticks in your mind?
Yes, there is. When I was first training in genetics, really 20 years ago now, there was a little girl who I saw who was a toddler at the time, and she was not meeting her developmental milestones. She had a very small head. She wasn't growing as she would be expected to, and she had problems with her vision. And her parents were absolutely desperate to find the answer to why she was experiencing these problems. She was their first child, and they were going through what I now know as the diagnostic odyssey, that process of undergoing test after test after test. And some of them came back showing slightly unusual results, but none of them provided the explanation. We were very convinced, and I'm still sure, that she did have a genetic condition, but none of the relatively limited palette of tests that we could offer at that stage were able to explain the condition for that little girl and for her parents. And I remember feeling a deep frustration that despite our understanding of so much in the way of genetics, we just couldn't answer their question. We didn't have the tools available. And I think at that stage, I would have been very surprised at the extent to which the tools have evolved and how quickly they've evolved over the subsequent couple of decades. And I left the centre where the little girl was being looked after shortly after I had met her and her parents. But I very much hope that she and her parents continued with their search for an explanation, because the number of opportunities to have an explanation since that time has increased massively. So from the Deciphering Developmental Disorders programme through the 100,000 Genomes programme, and then through the whole genome sequencing services, which are now available as standard on the NHS. There are now opportunities for diagnoses which we couldn't have imagined at the time when I saw her. So I very much hope that she does now have an answer.
Yeah, I think the speed at which these changes have happened is what's taken us all by surprise, isn't it? That, if we went back to our professional selves 20 years ago, I don't think we'd be able to comprehend how quickly this has come in.
Yes, and I think that means that we should remain very excited for the next 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because we talked about how actually the work that we are doing is kind of almost driving those developments themselves. So as we test more, we learn more and can implement more.
Yes, absolutely. And we're really increasingly focusing on that crucial stage between the point at which a new understanding or a new technology is understood enough to be clear that it's going to be useful and in what sort of circumstances it can be useful in healthcare, but the gap between that and actually having it available to participants and patients around the country in an equitable way, in a way that we understand and can use and can act on, is quite a big gap. And I think we're increasingly focusing in that gap at Genomics England and more broadly across the ecosystem. And that's an absolutely fascinating gap to work in, and is really the area where there are very big benefits to be obtained.
Yeah. So is it cases like the one that you've described, is it that drives you?
Yes, absolutely. So the work that I do at Genomics England and also in the laboratory at Guy's is very much about how can we organise ourselves as an ecosystem to make sure that we are maximising the resources and the understanding that we have to bring as many insights to healthcare as we possibly can for as many patients as we possibly can in a way which works for patients, for research participants and for the NHS.
So can you tell us a little bit more then about your work at Genomics England?
Yes, so at the moment, my work is mainly on two different programmes. So one of those is the diagnostic genome sequencing service that we offer to the NHS. And this service brings together samples from patients around the country and analyses them through the same analysis pipeline and then returns the results back to the NHS to be analysed and reported and used in healthcare. And I'm really proud of the things that we've achieved in that service in recent years. By having this data analysed in the way that it is, we have been able to gain all sorts of insights by comparing the results from patients around the country, all within the data protection frameworks of the NHS, and all with transparency with the patients who are taking part in the service and using the service. And So from those insights, we've been able to do things like work out that a particular change in a particular gene is seen in different people around the country who have the same condition. And that really helps us to understand that that gene change is causing that condition in those people. So it's really moved on our understanding of how genes and the changes in those genes are causing health problems around the country. We've also been able to use the data for research. So with consent from participants, their genome data and their health data is made available to approved researchers in a secure research environment, the National Genomic Research Library. And as a result of those analyses, there have been many insights and papers published. But also, we hold the link to be able to take outputs of that research and reattach the information about which patient and which area of the country that genome came from, and then to pass that information back through the NHS to the patients. So we've had over 2,000 patients who've had a diagnosis through this diagnostic discovery pathway, which is only possible because the data is all held in the same place. And expert researchers can look across the whole set of information from all of the patients and find new genes and new diagnoses, which we are then able to return to individual patients. And I think the power of that has been really exciting to see that happening, and to see the enthusiasm that patients and the NHS have for using data in that way to help patients, to help the health service, and to drive our understanding of genomics further.
And I love your description of it as an ecosystem, because I think that absolutely sums it up really well.
Yes, and all parts of the ecosystem are crucial here. So when patients are having a whole genome sequence on the NHS, their local team will talk to them about would they like their data to be available for research use, and will explain the benefits and potential risks of that. The patients then choose whether to sign up or not, and then the data is transferred into the research environment with the identifiers removed by the Genomics England team, and then researchers who've been approved by our Access Review Committee can then come in, carry out that research. They then return us their results, and those are either published or returned to the NHS, or both. And so that you can see the number of people who are involved in that end-to-end process. This really is a team effort.
Fantastic. Are you involved in any other projects at Genomics England?
Yes. So the other big project that I'm closely involved in at the moment is the Generation Study. And again, that's really driven from the experience of meeting patients who have developed rare conditions in childhood. So I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with the fact that while each rare disease is individually rare, there are many thousands of rare diseases. And so collectively, they are quite common, and they have a big impact on patients and on the NHS. And when you see patients who have a rare condition and who go through that diagnostic odyssey that I was talking about earlier, and it takes, in some cases, a number of years to make a diagnosis, we're now increasingly seeing that it's still a minority of rare disorders for which there is a specific treatment, but there are now several hundred rare disorders for which there is a specific treatment. And if you can start that treatment sooner, you can potentially prevent some of these problems from developing. And it's very sad when you realise that you make a diagnosis where there would have been a treatment or an intervention if that diagnosis had been made for that family at an earlier stage. And so that's really the experience which has driven the thinking around the Generation Study, where we're aiming to, it's a research study. We're aiming to recruit 100,000 babies with the consent of their families, and take a sample of their cord blood and test that for around 200 rare conditions. And the conditions have been selected such that there is a treatment available, and that if you offer that treatment at an earlier stage in life, you can prevent some of the symptoms developing. And in some cases, that can even represent a cure.
Which is just incredible. Thinking of the conversations that we would have had with ourselves 20 years ago, it's just incredible that is even an option for a research study today. Yes,
absolutely. And I think having specific treatments for many of the conditions that we can now diagnose has been an absolute game changer. And we have an amazing group of participants who form a panel who advise us about priorities for patients and research participants in genomics. And one of the things that our participant panel is very understandably keen for us to focus on is how do we increasingly try and increase the number of rare rare disorders for which there is a specific treatment, and then how do we ensure that those treatments are available to patients as quickly as possible and as early as possible in their own journey. And that very much reflects the national focus on rare disease as well, with the UK rare disease framework.
Fantastic. So thinking of all those incredible projects that you're working within, what does a good day look like for you? What's the most rewarding day for you at work?
Well, I think I'm very lucky in my job that it's very varied. So I will sometimes be spending time, as I did this morning, talking to our amazing bioinformatics team about our pipelines, because we recognise that the service that we offer in the NHS has achieved a lot, and it has been a real team effort, and it has achieved things that I think, we are extremely proud of in the way of knowledge basing, diagnostic discovery, use of the data for research. But we recognise that there is a huge amount still to do. The service models are not where they could be in terms of being optimal for patients and for the NHS. And technology has moved on and knowledge has moved on, and we need to be making sure that we're always driving forward and driving those boundaries. So this morning I had a fascinating meeting with our amazing bioinformatics team where we were thinking about those boundaries and that future and what that could look like and how do we prepare ourselves for it. Tomorrow, for example, we have a meeting with NHS partners who are delivering the Generation study, where we'll be talking about where else in the country we could open the study and how do we make sure that we enrol babies from the full range of backgrounds and the full range of areas in the UK in the study. So again, another very interesting conversation with NHS partners. So I think I'm very lucky that I get to have these sorts of conversations and be thinking about these very interesting questions really as my day job.
Yeah. So on the flip side then, what are the most challenging elements of your work?
I think one of the big challenges is that we would always all like to go faster than we go, and I think that's natural. I think that's right that we should keep that focus on trying to go as fast as possible and try and drive things forward as fast as possible in the complex ecosystem that we work in. So probably sometimes that slight feeling of kind of impatience that we'd like to go faster, but I think that's something which is important and something which is a challenge but is important to hold on to.
Yeah. So thinking about mainstream staff who are maybe starting to introduce genomics into their practice for the first time, what advice would you offer to them from your perspective?
Well, I think genomics is expanding. It is expanding our understanding of all sorts of areas of medicine. We see a future where actually genomics plays a part in a huge proportion of healthcare interactions. So, for example, we now understand quite a lot about what we call pharmacogenomics, or the relationship between changes in our genome and the ways in which we do or don't respond to medicines, both responding well, not responding, or having adverse effects to medicines. There's a lot of work going on nationally and internationally around how we use that information really well in healthcare. But I can imagine that in the relatively near future, if you think about some of the medicines for which these sorts of interactions are likely to be possible, there will be a need for example, pharmacogenomic information to be available to GPs and to many specialists across secondary care. And having the right sense of what to do with that information and how to use it is going to be absolutely crucial. So that doesn't mean that every member of the workforce across the whole of the NHS needs to understand the details of DNA and being made up of A's and C's and G's and T's and and the nature of different inheritance patterns and the ways in which those do and don't always apply. We're always going to need complex genomic questions for patients to be tackled by specific experts who do this all of the time or do it as a large proportion of their practice. But it definitely means that there is going to be a basic level of knowledge which is crucial, both for pharmacogenomics, for the increasing role of genomic diagnostics, and also potentially in an increasing role in risk prediction in the future.
Yeah, and I think that echoes the work that as education lead within NEY I've tried to kind of focus on, is that kind of basic knowledge and kind of almost that reassurance that staff need, that they're not expected to know it all and not expected to know it all in one go. They just need to know the red flags and they need to know where to access that information and how to support the patient on that journey.
Yes, and I think sometimes genomics can sound complicated. It sounds as if it's we didn't learn very much about it at medical school. It sounds sounds as if it sounds quite intimidating. And actually, there is nothing in the basics of genomics and how that applies to the patient pathway that doesn't apply to a lot of other things that, clinicians across the NHS and patients across the NHS are already having lots of complex conversations about radiology and about other forms of diagnostic testing and about other forms of treatment and risks and benefits. It's very much the same as those conversations. There's nothing more complicated than that. It's just adapting the thought process around the nature of the particular genomic tests that a particular individual is encountering in their practice.
Yeah, and again, it's a symptom of that speed at which this has all come in. That those who trained 20 years ago that are maybe in more senior, clinical nurse specialist type roles, so maybe dealing with the more complex elements of their specialty, actually 20 years ago won't have done much genomics in their training. So there is this natural knowledge gap, isn't there? That's because it's come in so quickly, and so I kind of, again, that's part of what we've been trying to work on, and again that shift of change even in terminology away from genetics to genomics. It's a term that isn't necessarily readily recognised for what it is.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we're very lucky in the UK that we've had the great focus on education across the ecosystem and on the workforce. And we've had the development of competency frameworks. We've had the development of the GMSA network. We've had the work done by the Genomics Education Programme. And these have all really contributed, I think, to a fantastic set of resources, which are available in all sorts of different formats for clinicians and for patients. And I think we're very lucky to have those resources and also the networks of people going out there, making people aware of them and making sure that people know where to look and giving people some advice and sort of getting a first toehold in the in that process of really thinking about genomics and what it means for them.
So thinking then towards the future and all the elements of genomics that are currently in the development, what would you say is the most exciting element of all of that?
I think that there are a number of different elements which I think are really exciting. So I think it's always important not to jump straight to the kind of the really new things. I think we've got a lot of work still to do on diagnosis and in making sure that rare disease patients get diagnoses faster and they get really accurate and early diagnostic information. So there's a lot we can do there, which will continue to make a really big difference. I think once you have a diagnosis, then moving into the question of therapies, there are some incredibly exciting therapeutic developments coming with targeted treatments that have started to be used in very, very rare conditions where you're targeting the fundamental DNA change, which is a whole new paradigm for treatment, which is massively exciting. There are similar shifts in paradigms in cancer, where understanding the way that genomics drives tumours to develop and then grow and then spread is a huge area of research and of interest in understanding how we better treat and manage cancer. So there are, again, huge developments coming there. Pharmacogenomics, I think, is an area which stands to potentially revolutionise the way we apply medicines, understanding who to give what medicine to and having to use the trial and error much less, moving to this greater era of personalisation. And then also in the trying to move upstream of the diagnostic world. So with the Generation study and other studies in genomics in newborn screening, I think that's another area where there is still a lot we don't know. It's very much in the realms of research at the moment, but it feels like exactly the right time to be exploring the role of genomics and to generating evidence so that we can really understand what genomics can and can't offer us in the context of newborn screening, and how can we get upstream of diagnoses for as many patients as possible where that's demonstrated to be something that makes a difference. Yeah.
All amazing areas, aren't they? And you're right, it's difficult to pick just one of them. So thinking about that future picture, where do you see Genomic England's role as fitting into that?
Well, we've been doing a lot of thinking in the last year or so about our role and where we focus in the future. And we feel that it's very important for us at Genomics England to focus on the key areas where we can really add value. There are many things across the UK genomics ecosystem which are not best done by us and which are best done local to the patient or in other locations. But there are a number of areas where we really feel that Genomics England can add value. One of those is in doing things at national scale. scale. It's quite difficult to operate at national scale in diagnostic services, and we really want to build on the elements of the national scale which bring the value to patients and to the NHS. So that really involves our expertise in bioinformatics and in the compute and the storage and the technology and the foundations which underlie that bioinformatics offer. We also see ourselves very much as having a role in innovation and in that process of bringing new technologies and new insights to the clinic and finding ways of testing those and working out how to use them and then being ready for the NHS to pick those up and deliver them efficiently and equitably. So we really see ourselves as the data and evidence engine for UK healthcare genomics. And then finally, I think the other role that we have played and that we're very interested in continuing to play is around the dialogue around genomics. So genomics is a complicated field. It has implications for patients and for the way that data is used and so on. And we've run some extensive public dialogues about some of the work that we've done already, for example, in the Generation study. And we definitely see ourselves continuing to play a role in that conversation and in really convening the ecosystem around the future of genomics in the UK.
So for the final question, Ellen, where do you think your ambition is going to take you next?
Well, I think if I look back at the career I've had so far, I've absolutely loved the various jobs that I have done. I think looking back at it, I can see how it all fits together, how it sort of builds and how I laid the foundations for each stage. I can't claim that I could have looked forward at it and seen how it was all going to pan out or what the opportunities were going to be. So I think the most important thing for me is to do something that you enjoy, where you feel that you're making an impact. And that's very much true for me at the moment, and I feel very lucky in that. So I will continue to look out for opportunities to make that impact in the areas that we've discussed. And I think genomics is, it's here to stay. It's growing, and the more of us are enthused about it and working in it and really thinking about how to do it really well for patients and participants and the NHS, I think that will keep me going to the end of my career.
Yeah. Well, it's been absolutely fantastic to hear your stories. Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. If you would like more information about the topics that we have discussed, then you can find these at our website, www.ney-genomics.org/podcasts, where you'll also find all the episodes in our podcast series. These can also be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all other podcast platforms.